Hi, I'm Dustin Saldarriaga, an immigration lawyer with Scott Legal PC in New York City. And in this video, we're continuing our series on the E-2 visa. In the series, we've been looking at the E-2 investor visa requirements. In this video, we're shifting gears a bit to discuss the E-2 employee visa. The E-2 employee visa is available to certain foreign nationals who are coming to the United States to work for the E-2 business as a manager, executive, or specialized employee. This can be an excellent option for the E-2 business to hire foreign nationals, particularly since the application process is usually quicker and more streamlined than other work visa options, like the L-1 visa or the H-1B visa. Before we dive in, if you're interested in more information about the E-2 visa requirements, we've posted to our YouTube channel our full webinar on the E-2 visa. We also share a lot of free information about the E-2 visa and other visas on our blog. We'll link to both our blog and our YouTube channel below. Finally, please remember that no video or blog post can replace the value of working directly with an immigration lawyer who can navigate the specific nuances of your application. So let's take a look at the E-2 employee visa. When an E-2 investor's visa is approved, their E-2 business is given the nationality of the E-2 investor. For example, if a German national owns 100% of the E-2 business, that business has German nationality. If a German national shares 50-50 ownership with an Italian national, the E-2 business has both German and Italian nationality. For a detailed discussion on these topics, please check out our videos on the E-2 nationality requirement and the ownership requirement. One of the reasons why the nationality of the E-2 business is important is that nationals of the business's country or countries of nationality can apply for an E-2 employee visa, which enables them to come to the United States to work for the E-2 company. So, in our earlier example, the E-2 company that's owned half by a German national and half by an Italian national can hire eligible foreign nationals from either Germany or Italy. They can then come to the US to work for the E-2 business. In this way, the E-2 employee visa looks a lot like the L visa. However, the process of applying for an E-2 employee visa is usually quicker and more straightforward than other work visa options, including the L visa. Also, E-2 employees have the same ability as E-2 investors to bring their spouse and children on derivative E-2 visas. Spouses of E-2 employees receive authorization to work anywhere in the US, and children of E-2 employees can attend school. Spouses can also attend school. In order to qualify for an E-2 employee visa, the employee must hold a valid passport from the same country of nationality as the E-2 business. Like the E-2 investor, the E-2 employee must also intend to depart the United States at the end of their visa. For more information on this requirement, check out our separate video on the E-2 intent to depart requirement. Also, if the E-2 investor is living in the United States, they must maintain valid E-2 status. As soon as they don't, the company becomes ineligible to support E-2 employees. Please note that this only applies if there is an E-2 investor and if they're physically within the United States. It's possible for an E-2 business to have E-2 employees without the investors and owners of the business themselves having E-2 investor visas. For example, if a company based in the US is owned by a German national who's entirely based in Germany, the company could be registered as an E-2 company with German nationality, even if the owner decides not to apply for an E-2 investor visa. Since the company itself is registered, it could employ E-2 employees. Now, not all nationals of the E-2 treaty country qualify for an E-2 employee visa. The E-2 employee visa is reserved for managers, executives, supervisors, specialized employees, or essential employees. We'll break these into two broad categories and discuss the requirements for each in this video. In the first category, we have managers, executives, and supervisors. In the second category, we have specialized and essential employees. So let's take a look at the E-2 employee visa for managers, executives, and supervisors. An E-2 employee applicant aiming to be classified as a manager, executive, or supervisor must show that they'll be primarily performing executive or supervisory tasks at the company. They must also have a high degree of responsibility within the business, and they must have control over either the entire company or over key functions of the company. Applicants would show this by submitting in their application organizational charts showing the company's structure, a job description that details the duties the applicant will perform, a resume showing that the applicant has the required experience, and a letter from the E-2 company that describes the business, the job, and the employee's qualifications. The government will also look at the employee's job title and salary, so both should reflect the level of responsibility held by the employee and indicate that the role is actually a managerial or executive one. Now let's turn to the E-2 employee visa for specialized or essential workers. An individual applying for E-2 employee classification as an essential or specialized employee must show that they have specialized or unique knowledge or skills that are essential to the success of the E-2 business. For example, a Japanese national who is a renowned sushi chef could pursue an E-2 specialized employee visa to work at a Japanese E-2 business that operates a sushi restaurant in the United States. The government will also consider the salary that will be paid to the specialized worker, the amount of experience or training that's required to gain the expertise, whether U.S. workers would be likely to have the required skills or expertise, and how long the business will require the skill or expertise for. For example, the government may expect to see that the sushi chef in our example will train U.S. workers as sushi chefs, thus eventually eliminating the need for the business to employ an E-2 employee as a sushi chef. For this reason, it's generally much easier to get an E-2 employee visa for a specialized or essential worker for the short term rather than the long term. The government's receptive to the argument that a business requires specialized skills as part of its startup activities or for the training and supervision of other employees will ultimately perform the specialized tasks themselves. It can be far more challenging for the applicant to show that their skills are specialized or essential in the long term. This would require the E-2 company and the applicant to prove that the skills will be needed continuously and that they're so specialized that a U.S. worker could not be trained to take over the position. This is not to say that a long-term E-2 specialized or essential employee visa is impossible. E-2 companies may be able to show that the specialized or essential employee is needed on a long-term basis if they're involved in the creation of a specialized product or can provide skills or expertise that are not readily available in the U.S. In some cases, an E-2 employee visa can also be a good alternative to applying for two E-2 investor visas. If two business partners are thinking about starting a business in the U.S. and both plan to have an executive role in the company, it may be possible for one applicant to pursue an E-2 investor visa, while the other pursues an E-2 employee visa as an executive. As long as the E-2 investor qualifies for the E-2 investor visa, this would free the executive applying for the E-2 employee visa from the obligation to make a substantial investment into the company and from holding any ownership stake in the company. The E-2 employee status would be dependent on the status of the company, meaning that if the E-2 investor becomes ineligible at any point, such as by holding less than 50% of the business or getting a green card, the E-2 employee's visa would also immediately become invalid. So let's turn to several questions that frequently come up for those who are considering the E-2 employee visa. First, does the E-2 employee need to have a degree or need to meet any other educational requirements? Fortunately, the E-2 visa does not require that the E-2 employee or the E-2 investor have any specific educational background. While it could be helpful to have such background if it's in a field related to the E-2 business, this is not required. That being said, it's important to show that the applicant has some relevant experience in the field, even if that experience was gained outside of a school setting. If the applicant's applying under the executive, manager, or supervisor category, then the applicant should demonstrate that they've experienced managing a business or a department. If the individual is applying under the specialized or essential skills E-2 employee category, then they'll need to demonstrate that they have essential and unique skills. In most cases, this would require that they show that they have at least some experience in the particular industry. Put differently, if no education or experience are required to gain the skills, then the government's likely to conclude that the skills are probably not unique or specialized. Also, there's no requirement that the essential E-2 employee applicant have previously worked at the company unless the skills they'll bring to the E-2 company are based on a familiarity with the overseas operations. Another common question we get is whether there's a specific salary that the business must pay the E-2 employee. While there's no minimum salary that the E-2 employee must be paid, salary is one of the factors the government officer will consider when deciding whether to approve the E-2 employee visa. For example, if the E-2 company wants to employ a chief executive officer as an E-2 employee, but only offers a salary of $40,000 for the role, the officer could have doubts whether the person will really be working as a CEO, which usually commands a much higher salary. A third common question is for how long the E-2 employee visa is issued. This will usually depend on the reciprocity agreement that the United States has with the home country of which the company and employee are nationals. Additionally, the period of time for which a visa can be granted can depend on when the E-2 investor's visa expires or when the company's E-2 visa registration expires. Subject to the government's discretion, the E-2 employee visa can also be renewed indefinitely, as long as the E-2 company and its E-2 investor owners remain eligible. The E-2 investor, if there is one, must also maintain E-2 status anytime they're physically within the United States. We hope this video about the E-2 employee visa was helpful. If it was, please click the like and subscribe buttons below to stay updated on future videos about visa options and travel to the US. Thank you for watching.